The engine's characteristic hum served as Carter Hayes's refuge. Flying was his sacred right. And Maverick, his canine companion, consistently slept during these flights until today. The German shepherd abruptly rose, whimpering, pressing himself against the cockpit window. His gaze was fixed on an island Carter had flown over countless times, a place consisting solely of rock and pine. Carter, irritated by the interruption of his cherished stillness, banked the plane lower. He was poised to admonish the dog. But then he saw it, an arrangement that defied natural formation. 3 enormous letters, painstakingly formed from broken logs and stones, silently screamed from the desolate beach. An SOS emanating from a place devoid of life. Carter faced a choice: disregard it and maintain his serenity, or descend into that barren zone to confront whatever or whoever had created them. We invite you to lend your support by subscribing to the channel. The ceaseless drone of the Lycoming engine was the sole constant. It was a deep, resonant thrum that permeated the metallic framework of the 1975 Cessna 185, vibrated through the pedals beneath Carter's boots, and ascended deep into his very being. For Carter Hayes, this sound wasn't mere noise. It was a sanctuary. It represented the barrier he had erected around himself at 3,000 feet above the frigid, rugged coastline of Maine. Carter's eyes flickered to the instruments, scrupulously evaluating the dials with a precision cultivated over decades. Altitude steady, airspeed steady, fuel, oil pressure. All indicators were normal. He was a man of 45, yet the reflection gazing back from the dark glass of the altimeter appeared to be older. His face was a testament to arduous journeys, weathered by wind and sun, etched with lines that narrated a life lived outdoors and a past that stubbornly refused to subside. His brown hair, overly long and disheveled, was streaked with silver at the temples, tucked neatly beneath his headset. This was his consistent ritual. 3 times a week, contingent on Maine's notoriously capricious weather, he would take to the skies. He would depart from his secluded cabin on the coast, unfasten the tie-downs of his old float plane, and ascend into the heavens. This was not for enjoyment. It was not for the exhilaration of flight, though he had experienced that sensation once, a lifetime ago. Now it was a routine of maintenance. It was a meticulously planned route, a precise grid he traversed over the empty expanses of forest and the vast gray stretch of the Atlantic. The sky was an exquisite, empty enclosure, and he, its willing captive. The perpetual, deafening roar of the engine was a blessing, a physical sound barrier just loud enough, barely, to mute the persistent echoes. The echoes were ever present, lying in wait. They lingered in the silence of his cabin, in the brief lulls between waves crashing on his beach in the dead of night. They were the reverberations of shouts in a language he still comprehended. The sharp, metallic clangs of equipment, the final strangled cry of his comrade Adrian, the ritual, the flight, the engine's drone. These were the sole mechanisms keeping the specters at bay. Beside him, in the co-pilot seat, his sole companion stirred. His name was Maverick, a 6-year-old German shepherd, a magnificent creature of gray and white with intelligent amber eyes that missed nothing. He was not merely a pet. He was a comrade, the only living being Carter permitted into his meticulously regulated existence. Maverick was Carter's bedrock, his early warning mechanism. The dog comprehended the topography of Carter's trauma more profoundly than any human could, discerning the subtle tremors of a memory long before it materialized. At present, Maverick was composed, his head resting on his paws, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He was accustomed to the flights, accustomed to the pervasive noise. He was an integral part of the ritual. Carter extended his gloved hand, finding the dog's head, gently scratching behind his alert, erect ears. "Just us, Mav," Carter murmured, though his voice was swallowed by the engine's ferocious roar. They continued their flight, the gray water extending to a gray horizon. They passed over small, uninhabited islands, masses of dark granite and dense pine that resembled forgotten fragments of the world. Carter checked his watch. Another 15 minutes, and he could initiate his return. The ritual would be complete. He could land, secure the plane, and retreat to the sanctuary of his cabin before the sun began its descent. Then, the ritual fractured. It commenced not with a sound, but with an intrinsic sensation. A subtle shift within the cabin. Maverick raised his head, his ears swiveling. A low, anxious whimper, barely audible above the engine, resonated in the dog's throat. Carter's hand, resting on the yoke, tensed. He glanced at the dog. "What is it?" Maverick rose as much as his seatbelt harness permitted, placing his front paws on the dashboard. His claws produced a faint tapping sound against the plastic. He wasn't looking at Carter. His gaze was fixated on the ocean below, specifically on a darkening shape that was steadily enlarging. Musal Island, a desolate, wind-swept rock formation known only to lobstermen and gulls. "It's nothing, Mav, just rocks." But Maverick's insistence intensified. The whine escalated in pitch, a true expression of distress. He pressed his wet nose against the windscreen, his body trembling almost imperceptibly. Carter felt a sharp, hot surge of irritation. This was not part of the ritual. The ritual was fluid, predictable, and devoid of disruption. This was an unforeseen complication. He scanned the water surrounding the island, a submerged rock, a stranded seal. He banked the old Cessna, the wing dipping, affording him a clear vantage point of the island. It was precisely as he recalled. Sheer cliffs on 3 sides and a small, crescent-shaped beach on the leeward side, choked with driftwood and seaweed. He almost overlooked it. Just an intertwining of dark lines on the gray sand. Carter squinted. He circled lower, the engine's pitch altering as he gradually eased back the throttle. The plane descended, and the lines resolved into 3 distinct shapes. SOS. Carter stared, his mind refusing to process the image for an entire second. The letters were immense, formed from dark stones and massive pieces of driftwood, starkly contrasted against the sand. His initial reaction was not empathy. It was a profound, sudden surge of anger and intrusion. This was his sky, his empty sanctuary, and someone had dragged the chaotic, desperate problems of the world into it. People, a complication. His instinct, sharp and immediate, was to pull back on the yoke, ascend to his cruising altitude, and continue his flight. He had abandoned that world. He was not a rescuer. He was not a soldier. Not anymore. He was merely a man striving to endure his own recollections. He had nothing left to offer, and he desired no involvement. He had witnessed the consequences of involvement. It led to men like Adrian perishing in the dust. He leveled the plane, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the horizon, away from the island, but Maverick would not permit it. The dog began to bark, a sharp, frantic sound that pierced the engine's drone. He pawed at the dashboard, then turned his head, fixing Carter with a gaze of such unwavering certainty, such desperate entreaty, that Carter's resolve fractured. The dog knew. He always knew. Carter looked from the dog back to the desperate signal on the sand. The letters appeared diminutive, pathetic, and terrifyingly authentic. He sighed, a lengthy, ragged exhalation that seemed to emanate from the deepest, most weary part of him. The annoyance subsided, replaced by a cold, familiar sense of resignation. He trusted Maverick's instincts more than his own. The dog was his true compass, the only element of the world that had never deceived him, never failed him. If Maverick indicated trouble, trouble there was. "All right," Carter uttered, his voice a gravelly rumble. He clicked the button on his headset's microphone, though he knew he was communicating solely with the dog. "All right, Mav. We'll investigate." He banked the plane sharply, the engine groaning in protest as he further reduced the throttle, aligning with the small, sheltered cove. He lowered the flaps. The ritual was disrupted. The world, with all its clamor and all its suffering, had located him. Carter Hayes and his dog Maverick were descending. The world dissipated from a loud, vibrating blur into a torrent of white water. Carter cut the engine, and the sudden, profound silence was more startling than the engine's roar had ever been. The deep thrum that had been his insulation for the past hour was gone. And in its stead, silence. A thick, heavy, unnatural quiet that seemed to press against the thin metal skin of the Cessna. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic lapping of water against the aluminum floats. Carter remained seated for an extended moment, the quiet reverberating in his ears. It felt wrong. It felt exposed. Maverick, no longer whimpering, stood on the co-pilot's seat, his body rigid, his amber eyes fixed on the gray beach merely 50 yards away. "Okay," Carter announced, his own voice sounding loud and unpracticed. He unbuckled his seatbelt. He moved with an efficiency born of long habit. From behind his seat, he retrieved his old brown leather flight jacket. It was worn smooth in certain areas, the leather creased and dark, faintly redolent of oil and the cold sea air. It was an old confidant, a piece of protective gear. He shrugged it on. Beneath it, holstered on his belt, was his Sig Sauer P226. He never flew without it. He verified that the weapon was secure, his hand brushing against the cold steel. Next, he reached for Maverick's harness. It was a professional-grade tactical harness, not a civilian leash. Carter's hands moved adeptly, clicking the buckles into place over the dog's powerful shoulders. Maverick stood perfectly still, accepting the apparatus. He was familiar with this too. This was work. Carter grabbed a small waterproof dry bag, checked its contents, a compact first aid kit, a satellite phone, a length of rope, a flashlight, and slung it over his shoulder. He opened the cabin door. The hinges produced a minor protesting sound. The salt air assaulted him, cold and damp. He stepped onto the float, his boots echoing hollowly on the metal. He tied the plane's rope to a large, partially submerged rock, securing the knot with practiced efficiency. Maverick followed, moving with balance and a low stance, leaping from the float into the shallow water with a soft splash. They waded the final few feet to the beach. The grains of sand were rough, strewn with fragmented shells and thick tangles of dark seaweed. The SOS signal, viewed up close, was even more unsettling. The rocks were massive, the driftwood logs substantial. It had evidently required considerable effort and desperation to construct this. Carter surveyed the beach, his gaze sweeping in short, deliberate arcs. Left, right, up toward the tree line. Nothing. No movement. The island was unnervingly silent. The wind that had buffeted the aircraft at 1,000 feet was absent here, shielded by the towering granite cliffs encircling the small cove. Maverick, however, was already engaged in his task. He neither ran nor barked. His nose was pressed to the ground, his feathered tail held low and steady. He completely disregarded the SOS sign, moving past it towards the sole opening in the dense, dark spruce and pine forest, a narrow path that resembled a game trail. "What have you got there, Mav?" Carter murmured. Maverick advanced, his paws making no sound on the damp sand. He reached the entrance of the trail and halted. He did not look back. His entire body stiffened. A low, almost inaudible sound rumbled in his chest. It was not a bark, nor a warning, but a deep, controlled growl. Carter's hand shifted from his side to the grip of his handgun, his thumb locating the retention strap. He walked slowly, closing the distance to the dog, his eyes scanning the dark woods ahead of them. "Easy, boy." He reached Maverick's side and observed what the dog had discovered. It lay just to the side of the trail, partially concealed by a clump of tall wild grass and a patch of disturbed leaves, as if it had been accidentally kicked there. It was a hunting knife, a large one with a dark composite handle and a broad blade. The blade was caked with dark reddish-brown matter. It was not fresh or wet, but neither was it ancient. It was recent, a few days perhaps. This signified violence. The mental shift in Carter was instantaneous. The annoyance, the reluctance, the weariness, all of it dissipated. The cold resignation was supplanted by an even colder clarity. The specters of his past, those he flew to escape, were no longer impediments. They were his instruments. The soldier he had attempted to suppress took over. His initial thought was not of a victim. His initial thought was procedure, threat assessment. He did not touch the knife. He did not step into the woods. He looked at Maverick. "Back," he commanded, his voice a low, sharp whisper. Maverick instantly complied, retreating from the trail, his eyes still fixed on the dark opening. Carter backed up with him, his hand remaining on his weapon, his gaze never leaving the tree line. He moved swiftly, though not running, back across the sand, his boots crunching on the shells. Back to the water's edge, back to the aircraft. He clambered onto the float, Maverick leaping up beside him. Carter slid into the cockpit, his heart now pounding, not from fear, but from a sudden surge of adrenaline. This was a tactical situation, and the primary rule was communication. He grasped the comms radio handset. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," he stated, his voice steady. "This is Cessna November 5185 Kilo on the coast of Musal Island. I have found evidence of a violent encounter and a distress signal requesting immediate assistance." He released the button. The only response was a loud, empty hiss. Static. He attempted again. "Channel 16, the emergency frequency. Mayday, Mayday, any station. This is Cessna 85 Kilo. Do you copy?" Static. His stomach tightened. He flipped the switch for the main communications radio, dialing in the frequency for the nearest Coast Guard station in Bar Harbor. Static, just a barrier of empty noise. He grabbed the dry bag, his fingers fumbling momentarily with the clip. He pulled out the satellite phone, a heavy, rugged piece of equipment he kept for emergencies just like this. He flipped open the cover and powered it on. The screen illuminated. Searching for network. Carter held his breath, watching the small icon. The icon flashed, then transformed into a single stark message. No signal. He stared at it. He moved the phone around the cockpit, holding it up to the windscreen. Nothing. The message persisted. "No," he whispered. He understood with a sinking, sickening realization. The island. It wasn't merely a physical fortress. The towering granite cliffs that surrounded the cove, the ones that blocked the wind, were also blocking everything else. They had formed a perfect cup, a dead zone. He was as cut off from the world as the person who had written SOS. He sat back in his seat, the silence of the cockpit once again pressing in. He looked at the woods. He looked at his silent radios. He had two choices. He could start the engine, take off, and fly back to the mainland. It would take him 30 minutes to get high enough to obtain a signal, perhaps an hour before he could return with assistance. An hour. He considered the blood on the knife. An hour could be an eternity. He thought of Adrian bleeding out in the dust and the helicopters that had arrived just 5 minutes too late. Or he could stay. He looked at Maverick. The dog was no longer looking at the trail. He was looking at Carter. His gaze was steady, patient. He was waiting, waiting for the command, waiting for his partner to make the choice he already knew he would make. Carter scrubbed a hand over his face, the rough stubble on his jaw scratching his palm. The intrusion was no longer an annoyance. It was a duty, a failed communication check, a missing partner. This was a mission whether he wanted it to be or not. He let out a long, slow exhale. The resignation returned, but this time it was different. It was heavy, but it was solid. It was purpose. "All right, Mav," Carter said, his voice quiet but firm. He clipped the sat phone back to his belt, its useless screen dark. "We're on our own." He picked up the dry bag, stepped out onto the float, and with his dog at his side, ventured back to the island. Carter gave the command with a simple downward gesture of his left hand. "Lead on." Maverick, requiring no other cue, turned from the beach and entered the dark opening to the trail. The dog moved in a way Carter had witnessed 1,000 times in training, but never for real. He was no longer a companion. He was a tool, a living sensor array. He moved low, his body a silent gray-white shadow, placing each paw with deliberate care, his nose constantly testing the air, his ears swiveling, catching the slightest disturbance. Carter followed, his own movements echoing the dog's. He fell into the rhythm that had been drilled into him at Fort Bragg. His boots, which had crunched heavily on the beach's shells, were now silent on the soft, pine needle-covered earth. He moved in a crouch, his senses expanding outward. The forest was dense, far darker than the open beach. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled of salt, decaying pine, and the sharp metallic tang of the nearby ocean. The silence was absolute. There were no birds, no squirrels. The only sound was the faint, distant rhythm of the waves lapping the shore behind them, and the sound of his own controlled breathing. He kept his eyes on Maverick, watching the subtle shifts in the dog's body. They moved inland, perhaps 50 yards. The trail was narrow, hemmed in on both sides by thick walls of spruce and fir. Carter felt the oppressive weight of the cliffs above him, the same granite that had blocked his radio signal. He was in a stone cup, a trap. Maverick stopped. Carter stopped instantly, his hand moving from his belt to the grip of his Sig Sauer, his body disappearing behind the trunk of a massive pine. He waited. Maverick didn't growl. He simply stood, his head raised slightly, sniffing the air. He took one more step, then looked back at Carter, a clear, intelligent glance. He was signaling. Carter moved up, flanking the dog. He peered around the tree. The forest opened up into a small natural clearing, perhaps 30 feet across. It was a pocket of human presence in the deep wild, and it was wrong. Everything about it was amiss. It was a campsite, but it appeared as if it had been struck by a sudden violent wind. In the center was a small, cold fire pit, just a circle of stones filled with damp, dark ash. Beside it, an aluminum kettle lay on its side, a dark stain spreading into the dirt beneath it. A small blue dome tent was set up near the back, but it was partially collapsed, the rainfly flapping loosely from one side. It was the disarray, the scattering of personal items that conveyed a story of panic. A pair of women's hiking boots, high quality, scuffed, were thrown over near the tent's entrance, as if their owner had been yanked from them or had clambered out in a desperate hurry. A bright yellow rain poncho was snagged on a nearby bush, fluttering like a flag of surrender. A single overturned enamel mug, a waterproof bag, its contents, a map, a compass, a bag of trail mix spilled onto the ground. It all screamed hastily abandoned. "Clear," Carter whispered, more to himself than the dog. He gave Maverick a signal for watch. Maverick instantly understood. The dog moved to the center of the clearing near the fire pit. He did not sniff the ground. He did not investigate the tent. He faced the dark woods on the opposite side of the camp, the direction they had not yet explored. He stood perfectly still, a gray and white sentinel, his body tense, his ears erect, guarding Carter's back. Carter trusted the dog completely. He holstered his weapon, but kept his hand on the grip. He began his own methodical search. He moved to the tent. The zipper was torn, the fabric ripped away from the track. He pulled the flap aside. Empty. 2 sleeping bags were unrolled inside. One blue, one green. A backpack was overturned, its contents just like the ones outside. It was a scene of sudden, complete interruption. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the perimeter. What had transpired here? The blood on the knife? Had the person who used it come here, or had they been taken from here? His gaze fell on a log that had been dragged near the fire pit, clearly used as a bench. The yellow poncho he had observed snagged on the shrub was draped partially over it. There was something hidden beneath. He gently lifted the damp, slippery material. It was a book, a diary bound in plain, dark leather. One side was completely saturated, its cover warped and rigid. A simple leather strap kept it closed. A cold sensation tightened in Carter's stomach. This was the voice. This was the answer he sought. He glanced at Maverick. The dog remained motionless, a statue of perfect, alert stillness. Carter moved to the edge of the clearing, settling against a large, moss-covered boulder. The rock felt cold and hard against his back, yet it offered him a stable position. He could oversee the entire camp, the path they had followed, and he could see Maverick. He balanced his sidearm on his knee, his hand resting upon it. With his other hand, he worked at the stiff leather strap of the journal. It came free with a slight sucking sound. He opened the book. The initial pages were rigid. The paper was warped. The ink, a dark blue hue, had blurred in certain areas due to the dampness, but it remained legible. The handwriting was a strong, clear, feminine script. The first page contained only a name. This journal belongs to Dolores. Carter felt a jolt. A name, not merely a sign, not merely a victim. Dolores. He skipped the first few entries. They were dated. Written from Bar Harbor. They were cheerful. Sailing with Evan. The weather is perfect. He's so happy. Carter's thumb moved faster, the pages generating a soft, damp tearing sound. He was looking for the shift, and he found it. The handwriting changed. It was no longer neat. It was hurried, sprawling, the letters pressed hard into the paper. Storm came out of nowhere. Rogue wave, the boat, it's gone. Evan is hurt, his leg. We swam, made it to a beach, an island. Just rocks and trees. We're alive. Carter continued reading, his pulse a low drum in his ears. He found the entry that mattered. It was dated simply. Day 3. Evan's fever is concerning. I cleaned the wound, but it's bad. I'm scared. But we did something good. We finished the SOS sign on the beach. Used the big rocks from the cliff and all the heavy driftwood. It's big. It has to be. Someone has to see it. Someone has to fly over. Please, someone see it. Carter closed the journal, his hand tightening on the cover. Dolores, Evan, they were real. He looked up from the page, the desperate hope in her words hanging in the dead, silent air of the camp. He looked at the overturned kettle, at the abandoned boots, at the cold, empty fire pit, and then his gaze moved to the trail he had just traversed, to the spot where the bloody knife had lain. They had been alive. They had been here, hoping to be rescued. Carter looked at Maverick. The dog was still watching the woods, unblinking. He knew what Carter now knew. They were not alone, and the people who wrote this journal had not simply departed. Carter's hand was numb from the cold. He had been seated against the boulder for several minutes, the open journal in his lap. The camp's silence was a palpable weight. He looked up, his eyes scanning the clearing. Maverick had not moved. The German shepherd stood like a gray-white statue near the cold fire pit, his head and tail perfectly level, his entire being focused on the dark, opposing trail. The dog's discipline was a silent reassurance, the only thing grounding Carter in the present. He looked back down at the journal. Dolores. Her name felt heavy on his mind. He had read the SOS entry, but there were more pages. He turned the damp, warped paper. The neat, hopeful script of the first days began to fray. Day 4. Evan is worse. The fever won't break. I did my best to clean the wound on his leg again, the one from the boat, but it's angry, red and angry. He's talking, but not to me. He's talking about home. I keep scanning the horizon. Nothing, just water. I have to stay strong. He needs me. Carter's own breath felt shallow. He recognized this. He recognized this kind of slow, creeping dread. It was worse than a firefight. It was the dread of the inevitable. The slow decay of hope. He turned the page. Day 6. I'm so tired. The cold. It gets in everywhere. Even the fire doesn't seem to work right. Evan didn't eat this morning. He just stares. I read to him from the one book we saved, but I don't think he hears me. I'm scared the SOS isn't big enough. What if they can't see it? What if no one comes? Carter's jaw tightened. He found himself scanning the empty clearing as if searching for her, a woman who was merely a ghost on a page. He saw the overturned boots near the tent. He imagined her sitting here in this exact spot, writing these words, her hands trembling from cold and fear. He turned to the final page. The change was a physical shock. This was not the same handwriting. This was not writing at all. It was a wound on the paper, a frantic scroll pressed so hard that the pen had torn through the page in places. The ink was smeared as if by rain or tears. He had to squint to decipher the words. Day 7. They saw it. They saw the SOS. A boat. Not Coast Guard. Just a boat washed up on the north side. Looked like it was in trouble, too. 2 men. They looked at us. They looked cold. Carter's blood went from cold to ice. His pulse, which had been a low thrum, suddenly spiked. The writing continued, sprawling across the bottom of the page. The last words jammed into the corner. They left, just left us here, said they'd be back. But the way they looked at Evan, the way they looked at me, they aren't rescuers. They aren't rescuers. Oh God, they're coming back. The last 3 words were barely legible. Carter stared at them. Oh, coming back. The world tilted. The damp, cold scent of the Maine forest vanished. Suddenly his nostrils were filled with the fine, choking dust of the Kunar province. The year was 2011. It wasn't a memory. It was a sensation. The sudden, biting cold of a high desert night. The oppressive silence before an operation. The specific metallic taste of fear that every soldier knows. The taste of adrenaline and stale water. He was on overwatch, lying on a ridge. The world a blurry green through his night vision. And he was waiting. He was waiting for the enemy to move. He was waiting for the trap to be sprung. It was the helplessness. The same helplessness that bled from Dolores's final words. He remembered the radio static in his ear, then the sudden chaotic burst of noise, the sharp cracking sounds of rifle fire erupting from the valley below. Then Adrian's voice, young, scared. Carter, they're everywhere. We're pinned. I'm pinned. Carter remembered his own voice, screaming commands, trying to get a location, trying to direct fire, but he was on the ridge 1,000 meters away. He was too far. He was helpless. Adrian, talk to me. Where are you? Silence, then just a whisper over the hot mic. Carter, they're coming back. A final burst of gunfire, then nothing. Just the ringing in his ears and the sound of his own ragged breath echoing in the vast, cold dark. They had found Adrian 4 hours later. Carter had been the one to carry him. He had failed him. He, the team leader, the protector, had been helpless, and Adrian had died for it. Carter's hand clenched, his knuckles white. The cheap leather cover of the journal groaned in his grip. A sudden movement. Carter's head snapped up, his hand flying to his sidearm, pulling the weapon free in one smooth, practiced motion. His heart was a jackhammer against his ribs. Maverick. The dog had not moved. He was still standing watch, a perfect, unwavering sentinel. He had not sensed the ghosts. He was focused on the present. Carter let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The scent of pine and salt rushed back in. He was in Maine. He was on the island. The dust of Afghanistan was gone. but the feeling remained. He looked down at the journal, at the last terrified words. He looked at the empty women's boots by the tent. Dolores, Evan. They were not strangers. They were not just a name on a page. They were Adrian. They were the mission he had failed, the promise he had broken. He had run to this empty coast, flown his ritualistic patterns, and surrounded himself with silence, all to escape that one feeling, the helplessness of that night in 2011. Now here it was again, but this time it was different. He was not on a ridge 1,000 meters away. He was here. He was on the ground. The people who wrote this journal, the ones who were terrified of the men who were coming back, they were his. He holstered his weapon. He carefully closed the journal, placing it with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed, into the dry bag at his side. It was no longer an intrusion. It was no longer a complication. It was personal. He stood up, his joints stiff from the cold rock. He looked at Maverick, the dog's head turned, his amber eyes meeting Carter's. Carter gave a single sharp nod. The decision was made. He would not be helpless. He would not let another voice go silent. He would not fail again. Carter Hayes stood up, the stiffness in his knees, a dull, distant ache. The cold from the granite boulder had seeped into him, but it was nothing compared to the ice water clarity now flooding his veins. The journal was secure in his dry bag. Its terrible, frantic last words seared into his mind. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a recovery, and it was personal. He looked at Maverick. The dog was still maintaining his watch, a perfect model of disciplined patience. He had not moved from his spot, his body a rigid line, his gaze still fixed on the dark, narrow trail that led away from the opposite side of the clearing. That was the direction. The ripped tent flap, the overturned boots. They pointed to a violent, panicked exit away from the beach, away from the trail they had used. It was the direction Dolores must have fled, or the direction they were taken. Carter moved to Maverick's side. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He placed his left hand on the dog's harness. He paused, establishing a firm base of support. With his right hand, he drew his Sig Sauer, the distinct sound of the Kydex holster releasing the weapon in a soft, precise click. He held the pistol in a low, ready stance, his index finger resting outside the trigger guard. "Track," he murmured, the single word hanging in the air. Maverick's entire frame tensed momentarily, acknowledging the directive. Then he commenced his movement. He neither bounded nor ran. Instead, he glided like a shadowy specter, his snout low to the earth, his paws producing no sound on the carpet of pine needles. He was pursuing an aroma imperceptible to Carter, a scent of terror and urgency left behind hours or even days prior. Carter followed closely, mirroring the dog's steps, his senses heightened to a level he hadn't experienced in years. The soldier was now fully alert. The world encompassed a 180-degree arc of impending responsibility. His eyes meticulously scanned the tree line, his ears strained against the oppressive silence, listening for the snap of a twig, the scuff of a boot, or the metallic ring of a weapon being prepared. The island's silence was no longer merely unsettling. It was overtly hostile, a void awaiting a sudden, violent sound to fill it. The path they followed here was not a path in the traditional sense, but rather a route of least resistance through the dense undergrowth. Branches heavy with damp moss snagged at his leather jacket. He brushed them aside, his gaze unwavering, fixed on Maverick's tail, a steady, downward-curved plume. As long as the tail remained steady, they were on the scent. They proceeded for 10 minutes, the campsite receding behind them, the ocean's roar diminishing to a distant, spectral whisper. They were now deep within the island's interior, a realm of shadows and ancient, silent trees. Maverick abruptly halted. He didn't just stop. He froze mid-stride, his left front paw uplifted, his head fixated, his nose pointed at a spot just off the barely discernible path. Carter stopped instantly, his heart a cold, weighty mass in his chest. He raised his pistol, his eyes scanning the area Maverick indicated. He saw nothing but a tangle of ferns and a large spruce tree. Maverick then lowered his head, a low, anxious whine vibrating in his chest. He took a hesitant step toward the spruce, then glanced back at Carter, his amber eyes wide. "What is it, boy?" Carter murmured, moving to shield the dog. Then he perceived it. It was not a natural feature. At the base of the spruce tree lay a pile of dead branches and pine boughs layered over a mound of dry leaves. It was out of place. The branches appeared too fresh, the breaks in the wood revealing pale, recent wounds. The leaves were dry, clearly gathered from a different part of the forest floor, unsuited for this damp hollow. It was a pile, a deliberate, hastily constructed heap approximately 3 feet in length. Carter's blood ran cold. He had encountered this before. This was either a cache or a grave. Maverick whined again, more insistently. He moved to the edge of the pile and began to dig, his front paws moving in a rapid scratching motion, casting leaves and dirt behind him. He was not playing. He was urgent. This was the scent. "Hold, Mav," Carter commanded, his voice taut. The dog's urgency was an alarming indicator. "Hold." Maverick paused, panting, looking back at Carter. "I'll do it." Carter maintained his pistol in his right hand, aimed at the darkened woods, while he knelt with his left. He reached forward, pulling at the freshly cut pine boughs. They detached easily, releasing a sharp, clean scent of resin that did nothing to mask the odor beneath. It was a damp, earthy smell mingled with something else, something metallic. He tossed the branches aside. Beneath them lay the pile of dry leaves. He swept them away with his forearm, his leather sleeve snagging on the twigs. His gloved fingers brushed against fabric. His breath caught. He jammed his pistol back into its holster, using both hands. He dug his fingers into the damp earth beneath the leaves and pulled. It was not a body. He exhaled, a sharp, sudden gasp of air. It was a piece of clothing. He pulled it free from the shallow depression. It was a man's jacket, a heavy, dark wool jacket, the kind worn by a sailor or fisherman. It was thoroughly soaked with dampness and dirt, but it was undeniably a jacket, and it was stained. He spread it on the ground. A large, dark, stiff stain covered the entire left shoulder and extended across the chest. There was no mistaking it. Even in the dim forest light, he could discern the dark, oxidized color. It was blood, and a copious amount of it. This was Evans. This was the wound Dolores had described. This was the source of the blood on the knife. Carter knelt, fixated on the jacket, his mind suddenly operating like a cold, calculating machine. He processed the scene, and a new, terrible understanding dawned on him. Fact 1. The campsite was a scene of pure, unadulterated panic. Overturned boots, a ripped tent, scattered gear, it depicted a sudden, chaotic attack. Fact 2. This jacket, the primary evidence of that attack, was not at the campsite. It was here, hundreds of yards away, deliberately concealed under a pile of freshly cut branches. The two facts formed a contradiction. Panic and concealment are antithetical. A panicked attacker, a surprised and enraged smuggler, would have left the evidence. They would have acted with brutality and departed. An animal would have dragged the body. But one does not hide evidence in a panic. One hides evidence when a plan is in place. One hides evidence when concerned about someone else discovering it. One hides evidence when attempting to control the narrative. This was not merely an attack. This was not a crime of passion. This was a calculated act of concealment. The men from the boat, those whom Dolores so feared, were not merely brutal. They were astute. They were methodical. They were still present, and they were covering their tracks. Carter stood up, the blood-caked jacket still clutched in his hand. He looked at Maverick. The dog was no longer digging. He was observing his partner, awaiting the next command. The situation had altered. This was no longer a rescue mission for a severely injured man. This was an infiltration into hostile territory against an adversary that was thinking, planning, and waiting. An enemy who was, at this very moment, somewhere on this confined, silent, inescapable island with Dolores and Evan. The light was fading. It was not a gentle golden dusk, but a cold, gray draining of color from the world. The sun had descended behind the island's western cliff face, plunging the dense forest into a premature twilight. The air grew heavy and cold, the temperature plummeting rapidly. Carter knelt in the gloom, the bloodied wool jacket in his hands. The metallic scent of old blood was sharp in the damp air. He contemplated the calculated concealment, then surveyed the darkening woods around him. This was not a suitable place to be at night. A tracker could operate in the dark, but a man walking into a planned ambush could not. The rules had fundamentally changed. "We're going back," he stated, his voice a low rumble. He folded the jacket, Evan's jacket, and tucked it inside his own against his chest. It was a cold, damp weight, a tangible piece of the enigma. He would not abandon it. "Heel," he commanded. Maverick, who had been patiently standing guard, moved instantly to Carter's left side, his shoulder brushing against Carter's knee. They began the trek back to the campsite, a journey that felt 10 times longer than the one they had just completed. Carter moved with a focused, silent intensity. The forest was no longer a place for investigation. It was a place for survival. Every shadow that shifted between the massive tree trunks represented a potential hiding place. Every whisper of wind through the high pine boughs sounded like a man's breathing. His hand remained on the grip of his pistol. Maverick mirrored his tension. The dog's body was coiled, his head low, his ears swiveling, sampling the air. He was a 90-pound predator, and he was on high alert. It took them 20 minutes to reach the clearing, and by then the world was a deep, starless blue-black. The small camp was a pool of deeper shadows, the torn tent a ghostly, flapping shape. Carter's foremost priority was security. He could not return to the plane. It was too exposed on the water. This clearing, with its single trail, was a poor defensive position, but it was all they had. He gave Maverick a quiet command to take up a watch post near the trail they had just vacated, and the dog vanished into the darkness. Carter, meanwhile, conducted a slow, silent perimeter check. He found a spot against the same mossy boulder he had previously occupied. It provided him with a solid back and a clear view of the clearing and the 2 trails leading into it. He sat, the cold of the rock seeping through his jacket. He was accustomed to the cold. He was accustomed to the dark. He was accustomed to the waiting. He listened. The island's oppressive silence had returned, now filled with the tiny rustling sounds of the night. He was cataloging them, distinguishing the natural from the unnatural, when Maverick reappeared. The dog did not bark. He simply materialized at Carter's side, a silent, gray-white shape. He pressed his cold, wet nose into Carter's hand, and then he growled. It was not the controlled, alert sound from the trail. This was a deep, chest-vibrating, throat-tearing sound. It was a threat. Maverick was not looking at the trail they had come from. He was staring at a dense patch of boulders and ferns on the far side of the clearing. Carter's hand was on his pistol. He raised it, pointing it into the darkness. "Who's there?" he commanded, his voice a low, hard bark designed to intimidate, to control. At first there was only silence. Then a human sound, a low, painful groan. "Stay back, Mav," Carter ordered. Maverick whined, his entire body quivering with a restrained, violent energy, but he held his position. "I said, who is there?" Carter called out, his voice louder. "Show yourself. Hands first, please." The voice was a cracked, desperate whisper. "Please don't shoot. I'm hurt." A figure moved. He was a man who was crawling, painstakingly pulling himself from the obscurity of the rocks. His form was a dark silhouette, propelling himself across the terrain with his arms, his left leg trailing behind him, utterly useless. He emerged into the faint, lingering illumination of the clearing, his hands raised and trembling. "Please," he panted. "Help me." He appeared to be a man in his early 40s, his face pale and glistening with perspiration, his eyes wide with an expression that could only be described as terror. He was clad in expensive yet tattered sailing attire. Upon seeing Carter, a large, dark figure holding a gun, his eyes widened even further. He flinched. "No, please, did they send you? Are they back?" Carter maintained the pistol's level aim. Maverick was now standing, teeth bared, emitting a constant, menacing growl. "Easy, Mav," Carter stated, his voice firm. The dog quieted but remained tense. "Who are you?" Carter inquired. The man collapsed onto his side, his breath catching in a sob. I'm Evan, my wife, Dolores. We were on the boat. Did you see her? Is she—" The name struck Carter like a blow. Evan. It perfectly matched the journal. Carter's mind raced, attempting to piece together the fragments. The man was acting. He had to be. "What happened?" Carter asked, his voice still hard, betraying no emotion. "Them? The man," Evan gasped, clutching his leg. "The other boat. Smugglers. I don't know. They found us yesterday. They were animals." His voice broke. They took Dolores. She tried to fight and I think they killed her. I think they killed her." He was sobbing now, a dry, rattling sound. Carter's face remained impassive. He believed none of it, yet the performance was convincing. "And you?" Carter pressed. "I tried," the man choked out. "I tried to stop them. One of them, he had a knife. He stabbed me." He gestured wildly at his leg. I ran. I hid. I've been in the rocks. I heard you. I thought you were them coming back to finish me. Please, you have to help me." Carter's gaze was frigid. He was a soldier, and this man was either a potential asset, a potential threat, or a victim. His training demanded he ascertain which. And despite his conviction that this was a fabrication, the memory of Adrian, the one he hadn't helped in time, served as a powerful incentive. His immediate duty was to tend to the wounded. "Maverick, watch," he commanded. He holstered his weapon. The man flinched as Carter approached him, but Carter disregarded it. He knelt, pulling out his dry bag. "I have a first aid kit." Thank you. The man, Vincent whispered, his eyes rolling. Carter extracted his shears. "I need to see the wound." It hurts," Vincent moaned. "I'm cutting the pant leg." Carter's voice was devoid of inflection. The shears produced a sharp tearing sound as they cut through the costly blood-soaked sailing pants. Carter peeled back the fabric and observed the wound. It was severe. A deep, vicious gash on the man's outer thigh. It was a laceration, just as he had described. It was not a gunshot wound. It was a knife wound, but it was the rest of the scene that screamed at Carter. The man was not bleeding profusely. The blood flow was sluggish, and around the wound, there was a clear, sharp line of demarcation in the caked blood, the impression of a bandage that had been tied very tightly and for a prolonged period. The wound itself, though deep, had been partially cleaned. Carter's field experience, his tactical medical training, bellowed at him. This was not the wound of a man who had been stabbed, run, and hidden in terror. This was not a wound that had been left to bleed out for the past 24 hours. If it had, the man would be dead from blood loss or in profound hypovolemic shock. This man was lucid. He was articulate. He was performing. This wound had been dressed. It had been bandaged hours ago, and the man had only just now removed the bandage. or perhaps it had fallen off to dramatize the situation. I tried to stop it, Vincent moaned as if reading his thoughts. I used a piece of my shirt. Carter's eyes were cold. He met the man's gaze. Hold still, he said. This is going to sting. He uncapped the bottle of antiseptic from his kit. He didn't just dab it. He poured it directly into the open wound. The man's reaction was immediate and explosive. He let out a piercing shriek, his entire body arching off the ground. It was a genuine, agonizing scream. At that moment, Carter knew two things for certain. One, the wound was absolutely real and excruciatingly painful. Two, the man was lying about everything else. Carter looked up from his task. Across the clearing, Maverick had not relaxed. The dog stood, his lips curled back in a silent, unwavering snarl. He was not looking at a victim. He was looking at an enemy. Vincent's shriek had been genuine, a raw sound of agony that had reverberated off the granite cliffs and then dissipated into the trees, leaving the clearing in a stunned, ringing silence. Carter withdrew his hands. The antiseptic had performed its function. He worked swiftly now, his hands moving with a medic's impersonal efficiency. He packed the laceration with sterile gauze and wrapped it tightly with a pressure bandage from his kit. The bleeding was controlled. Vincent was panting, his face pale and slick, his eyes shut tight. It, he gasped. It's done, Carter said, his voice flat. He repacked his medkit. The man was a liar. The man was also in real, undeniable pain. These two facts coexisted. A perilous combination. He couldn't abandon him here. Not because he trusted him, but because he simply couldn't. Leaving a wounded man in the dark, even a mendacious one, was a tactical vulnerability. A man in that much pain would make noise, attracting whatever else was on this island. And Carter needed to observe him. He was the sole link, the only surviving piece of the puzzle. "Can you walk?" Carter asked. Vincent attempted to push himself up, but his face turned ashen, and he fell back with a groan. "No, I can't. We're moving to the campsite. It's too exposed here." Carter's mind was active. He needed an open, observable space. He needed to keep this man within his sightline. "We can use the tent for a windbreak. It'll be warmer." It was a falsehood, but a logical one. Vincent nodded, his teeth chattering. Whether from cold or shock, Carter didn't care. Getting him there was a brutal 10-minute ordeal. Carter was not gentle. He hauled Vincent to his feet. The man's arm was draped over Carter's shoulders. Vincent tried to put weight on his uninjured leg, hopping and dragging his wounded one, his breath hissing through his teeth with every small movement. Maverick shadowed them, a gray-white specter in the darkness, his body low, his suspicion a palpable force. They reached the tattered clearing. Carter deposited Vincent near the cold fire pit, propping him against the same log Dolores had used as a bench. "Stay here," Carter ordered. He didn't wait for a response. He moved to his boulder, his chosen overwatch position. He needed a fire, not for warmth, but for light. A small, controlled, tactical flame, just enough to see by. He used his knife and a magnesium stick, shaving off small, hot sparks into a ball of dry tinder he'd gathered. A small, smokeless flame caught, flickered, and grew. The fire cast a small, wavering circle of orange light, pushing the oppressive, absolute darkness back by a few feet. It made the ripped tent and the scattered, abandoned gear look like a stage setting for a tragedy. Carter sat, his back against the solid rock, his legs crossed, his pistol resting on his thigh. He was comfortable. He had spent half his life in positions just like this, cold, weary, and awaiting an enemy's move. He tossed a foil-wrapped MRE ration bar across the fire. It landed softly in Vincent's lap. Vincent flinched, startled. He looked down at the bar, then at Carter. Thank you." "Eat," Carter said. It was not a suggestion. Vincent fumbled with the wrapper, his hands shaking. He took a small bite, chewing with difficulty. He looked from Carter, a silent dark shape against the rock, to Maverick. The dog had not settled. He was not lying down. He was not sniffing the perimeter. He was sitting. He sat just at the edge of the firelight, a perfect sphinx-like silhouette, his head up, his ears forward, his amber eyes reflecting the small flame. And he was staring. He was staring directly at Vincent. Vincent, attempting to bridge the gap, trying to establish the rapport of a fellow victim, tore off a small piece of the ration bar. He held it out, his voice a cooing sound. "Here, boy," Vincent said. "Good dog. You hungry?" Maverick did not stir. He did not growl. He did not even look at the food. His gaze remained fixed on Vincent's face. "He's a good boy, right?" Vincent said, his voice a strained, pathetic attempt at friendship. He tossed the piece of food. It landed on the dirt in front of the dog. Maverick's reaction was absolute. He did not sniff it. He did not acknowledge it. He simply kept his eyes on Vincent as if the food and the man were beneath his notice. After a moment, he deliberately turned his head just slightly away from the offering. It was a snub, a profound, animalistic gesture of pure contempt. Vincent's hand, still outstretched, slowly lowered. He looked at the dog, then at Carter. Carter's face was a shadow, unreadable. He's well-trained," Vincent said, his voice small. He quickly ate the rest of his bar. The night dragged on. The psychological battle was silent, fought in the space of that small, flickering fire. Carter did not sleep. He knew how. He would close his eyes for 5-10 seconds at a time, a tactical rest, but his senses remained sharp. He let the silence do the work. Eventually, Vincent couldn't tolerate it. This island," Vincent whispered, his voice raspy. It's a terrible place. You're not from around here, are you?" Carter stared into the fire. He said nothing. I can't believe Dolores is gone," Vincent continued, his voice catching. "She was everything. Those men. They were monsters. I hope you find them. I hope you—" Carter cut him off. His voice, a low and even rumble, was directed away from the man. "You need to rest. We'll depart at dawn." He wasn't inquiring. He wasn't engaging. He was observing, taking in the man's pupils in the firelight, the rhythm of his feigned sorrow, the way he emphasized his genuinely wounded arm. Vincent, finding his efforts rebuffed, eventually fell silent. He leaned his head against the log, his breathing shallowing, his eyes closing. A few dramatic, painful groans escaped him before he settled into a restless, light sleep, his face turned towards the flames. But Carter knew he wasn't truly asleep. He was a predator, much like Carter himself, merely biding his time. And throughout the long, cold hours, Maverick remained awake. The dog did not lie down, nor did he circle. He sat upright, a gray and white sentinel. He was a living lie detector, and he hadn't stirred from his post. He was a statue of judgment, his gaze unyielding, his breath a low, steady huff in the chill air. He was protecting his companion. The sky began its transition from black to a deep, bruised purple. The first cold light of the new day was mere moments away. Vincent stirred. He awoke with a pained groan, blinking as if emerging from a profound sleep. He looked at the fire, now reduced to white ash and glowing embers. He looked at Carter, who was still in his previous position, and then his gaze shifted to Maverick. The dog was still fixed on him. Vincent, perhaps out of frustration, or in a final desperate attempt to appear as a harmless victim, tried again. "Good boy," Vincent whispered, his voice thick. "You've been watching all night. Good dog." He slowly, theatrically extended his hand, palm up, to pet the animal. His arm stretched across the small, dormant fire pit. Maverick's response was the final unspoken word. He didn't growl. He didn't snap. He didn't even expose his teeth. He simply rose. He stood with silent, fluid grace. He took 3 deliberate steps, his claws making no sound on the packed earth. He walked past the cold fire, past Vincent's outstretched, trembling hand, and he sat down. He positioned himself directly between Vincent and Carter. He faced Vincent. His body was a solid, living shield, his shoulders broad, his head held high. He didn't look at Carter. He didn't need to. The message was as clear as a gunshot. You will not touch him. You will not reach him. I am between you, and I am watching. Vincent's hand froze mid-air. He stared at the dog's wide, furry back. The contempt was absolute, a physical rejection. He slowly, very slowly, pulled his hand back, clenching it into a fist at his side. Carter observed the entire exchange. The fire had died, and in the gray, cold light of the new day, he could see Vincent's face clearly for the first time. The mask of the grieving victim was gone. In its place, for just a second, was a flash of cold, hard fury. Carter's training had indicated the man was being deceitful. Maverick had just confirmed it. The gray dawn light was harsh. It offered no warmth, only a stark, unforgiving illumination that revealed the cold reality of the clearing. The fire was a circle of white ash. The tattered tent stood as a monument to old terror, and the man and the dog presented a portrait of absolute distrust. Carter Hayes rose to his feet. The movement produced a sharp cracking sound in the silence, his joints stiff and protesting from a night spent sitting on cold stone. He was a dark, formidable shape in the new light. His face was a mask of weary resolve. Vincent, who had been feigning a pained, restless sleep, opened his eyes. His victim mask was back, but it was thinner now. His eyes, though clouded with pretended exhaustion, were sharp. They darted from Carter to the dog and back. "What? What time is it?" Vincent inquired, his voice a dry rasp. "Is she—" Carter disregarded the question. He walked to the edge of the clearing and retrieved his dry bag. "I'm heading to the plane," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left no room for discussion. "The plane?" Vincent struggled to sit up, hissing as the movement aggravated his injured leg. "Is it time? Are we leaving?" "The morning air is different," Carter explained, the lie coming easily. "Denser. Sometimes the signal bounces off the atmosphere better at dawn. I'm going to try the radio again." He allowed the falsehood to hang in the air. No signal, no rescue. This was a logic Vincent's character was compelled to accept. "Yes," he affirmed, nodding, the relief in his voice just a bit too polished. "Yes, of course. Try the radio, please. We have to get off this island." "I'm leaving you water," Carter announced. He walked over and dropped a plastic bottle of water and one of his foil-wrapped ration bars on the ground, well out of Vincent's reach, compelling him to move for it. "Don't leave this clearing. Don't light a fire. Don't do anything." It was a command, not advice. "I won't. I can't," Vincent replied, gesturing to his heavily bandaged leg. "I'll be right here. Please, just hurry." Carter turned, his leather jacket groaning softly in the cold. "Maverick, heel." The word was a release. Maverick, who had been a statue of contempt all night, finally broke his stare. He stood, shook his entire body once, a violent rattling sound of fur and muscle as if to shed the man's very presence. He moved instantly to Carter's left side, his shoulder brushing his partner's thigh. Carter turned and walked out of the clearing, down the path toward the beach. He did not look back. He did not need to. He could feel Vincent's eyes on his back, a hot, calculating pressure. And he could feel Maverick at his side, a silent, living radar, his rear guard. If Vincent had attempted to move, if a branch had so much as snapped behind them, Maverick would have reacted before Carter's brain even registered the sound. They walked for 200 yards, the path damp and soft underfoot, the sounds of the camp fading, replaced by the distant, rhythmic sigh of the ocean. Then, out of sight and earshot, Carter stopped. He stood for a full minute, just breathing. He had been in guard mode for 10 hours, a static defensive posture. Now he needed to hunt. He needed to find the truth, the one that was not sitting back in that clearing. He needed to find Dolores and Evan. He looked down. Maverick was looking up at him, his amber eyes bright, intelligent, and questioning. He was waiting for the real command. "Okay, Mav," Carter said, his voice low. He reached down and scrubbed the dog's thick scruff, his gloved fingers digging into the fur. "No more games." He stepped off the path into the dense, dark woods, pushing past a curtain of wet spruce branches. He was no longer going to the beach. That was a lie for a liar. He pointed, not in a specific direction, but into the vast, unknown interior of the island. "Find," he commanded. The word was everything. It wasn't track, it wasn't heal, it was find. Find the missing, find the danger, find the scent that did not belong. Maverick's entire demeanor changed in an instant. He was no longer a guard. He was a hunter. His nose dropped to the damp earth, and he began to cast back and forth, snorting, pulling the air into his lungs, tasting the complex map of the island. He ignored the trail they had been on. He ignored the scent of Carter. He ignored the lingering sour sweat and fierce smell of Vincent that had contaminated the camp. He was looking for something new, and he found it. His head snapped up. He took a few quick steps to his right toward the spine of the granite ridge that formed the center of the island. His nose went down. His tail, which had been low and cautious, went straight out, rigid. He had it. Maverick moved, and Carter followed. This was not a trail. This was a brutal vertical climb. Carter used his hands, pulling himself up over moss-slicked rocks and weaving through tangled ancient roots. Maverick was a ghost, moving with an effortless four-legged efficiency, pausing every few yards to let his partner catch up, his nose always working. Carter was not an indoor man, but the climb left him breathing heavily, the cold air burning his lungs. He was trusting the dog completely, putting his life in Maverick's paws. They climbed for 15 minutes, ascending the ridge. As they got higher, the wind changed. The thick, damp smell of the forest floor was peeled away by a sharp, cold wind coming off the open ocean, and it brought a new smell with it. Carter caught it at the same time Maverick did. The dog stopped on a high ledge, his nose high in the air, sniffing, confirming. Carter smelled it too. Faint but undeniable. It was not pine. It was not salt. It was not the organic decay of the forest. It was a chemical bite, acid and poisoning. It was the unmistakable greasy tang of diesel fuel. And underneath it, just as the summary had suggested, was the sour animal smell of old sweat and the faint, stale odor of tobacco. This was it. This was the other boat, the one from the journal, the one Dolores had seen, the one Vincent had not mentioned. Maverick let out a single low woof, a sound of confirmation and urgency. He was pulling now, the scent strong in his nostrils. They crested the ridge. The wind up here was a physical force, screaming past Carter's ears, whipping his hair. From here he could see the ocean, but it was not the calm gray water of his cove. This was the north side of the island, a wild, churning expanse of white-capped waves. Maverick was already moving, leading him down a steep, treacherous game trail, his paws dislodging small stones that went rattling down into the abyss. The sound of the ocean grew from a sigh to a roar. This was not the gentle lapping of the beach. This was the harsh, crashing sound of waves smashing against sheer rock. They descended, the smell of diesel now so strong it was almost nauseating. The trail ended abruptly at a sheer 50-foot drop, a narrow ledge of rock. Carter stopped, his hand grabbing Maverick's harness to keep him from going over. He surveyed the scene below. A different cove, a concealed indentation, precisely as the summary had indicated. It comprised a jagged black rock inlet, a natural snare almost imperceptible from the ocean. And nestled there, against the rocks, listing to one side, buffeted by the surging waves, was a vessel. It was an antiquated, unsightly motor yacht, approximately 40 feet in length. Its paint was scored, its engine silent. This was the origin of the diesel. This was the sanctum. The tempestuous roar of the North Atlantic constituted a physical assault. Carter Hayes lay prone on the granite ridge, the wind mercilessly tearing at his jacket, his eyes watering from the cold and the stinging salt spray. 50 feet beneath, within the jagged black rock cove, the battered motor yacht was trapped. Waves, frothy and furious, crashed against its hull, making the entire craft groan and scrape against the clearly grounded rocks. Maverick was by his side, his body pressed low to the stone, his gray-white fur whipped by the wind. The dog's ears were flattened against his head, yet his nose continued to work, drawing in the overwhelming acrid scent of diesel fuel. This was the hideout. Carter scrutinized the cliff face. It was a sheer 50-foot drop, but it was not smooth. It consisted of fractured ancient granite, abundant with crevices and small ledges. To his right, a narrow chimney, a profound fissure in the rock, appeared to be a treacherous but viable path downward. There was no alternative. He had to descend. "Mav!" he yelled over the wind, his voice immediately lost. He needn't have shouted. He gestured first to the dog, then to himself, then to the path. "Easy. Stay close." The descent was a controlled fall. Carter went first, his boots finding impossible toe-sized indentations in the rock. His gloved fingers, numb and stiff, gripped the cold, wet stone. He moved with a ranger's efficiency, testing every handhold, his body light. His mind was solely focused on the next 3 feet. Maverick was right behind him, a four-legged marvel of agility. The dog moved with instinctive animal grace, his claws finding purchase where Carter's boot slipped, his body kept low and balanced. A piece of rock dislodged beneath Carter's boot. He slipped, his body lurching, but his left hand maintained its grip. A small cascade of pebbles rattled down to the beach, a sound entirely swallowed by the crashing waves. He froze, his heart pounding, but no one on the boat below reacted. He regained his footing and continued. It took 5 excruciating minutes, but they reached the bottom. The beach was not sand, but a treacherous expanse of black algae-covered stones the size of fists. The motor yacht was 30 yards away. It was aged, perhaps from the 1980s, its white and blue paint scarred and peeling. It was firmly beached, its stern tilted onto the rocks, and it was not abandoned. Even above the roar of the surf, Carter heard it. A sharp, metallic clinking sound. It was followed by a loud, muffled curse, a growl of pure frustration. Carter signaled Maverick with a flat, downward slicing motion of his hand. "Quiet." Maverick instantly froze, sinking into the shadows of the cliff wall. Carter moved, his feet silent on the wet stones, timing his steps with the rhythmic crash and retreat of the waves. He slipped from one large boulder to the next, closing the distance. He saw the source of the noise. On the aft deck of the boat, a large, burly man in a stained, grease-covered jacket was hunched over the open engine compartment. This was Sawyer. He was holding a large wrench, and he looked furious. He struck the engine block with the side of the tool, another loud, clanging sound. "Piece of junk," Sawyer growled, his voice a low bark that the wind carried to Carter. Sawyer was distracted. He was angry. He was focused on the engine. This was the opportune moment. Carter was about to move to find a way to board when he froze again. He heard another sound. It was not the wind. It was not Sawyer. It was not the waves. It was a low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It was muffled. It was emanating from inside the boat. Someone was kicking a bulkhead. Someone was alive. The entire mission's parameters snapped into a new, sharp focus. This was no longer merely a hunt. It was a hostage rescue, and Carter Hayes knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. He looked at Maverick. He gave the stay signal, a simple open palm gesture. The dog did not move, his body coiled like a spring, his eyes fixed on his partner. Carter moved from the shadow of the rocks, his pistol drawn but held low. The waves concealed his approach. He reached the stern. The boat rocked violently as a wave struck it, the movement disorienting. Sawyer cursed again, bracing himself against the engine. His back was to Carter. Carter climbed onto the deck. His boots made no sound. He was 3 feet behind Sawyer. He did not use the gun. A shot would reverberate, signaling his presence. He needed this man silenced. He moved. He dropped the gun back into its holster. In one fluid, brutal motion, his left arm wrapped around Sawyer's thick neck, his forearm cinching tight against the man's throat. His right hand locked onto the back of Sawyer's head, completing the blood choke. Sawyer's reaction was immediate, a huge, panicked grunt. His body arched, his thick arms flailing, dropping the heavy wrench with a loud metallic clatter onto the deck. He kicked back, but Carter maintained his balance, his center of gravity low. Sawyer's hands clawed at Carter's arm, but the hold was perfect. It was not about air. It was about pressure. 10 seconds. Sawyer's struggles weakened. 12 seconds. His body went limp. Carter held for 3 more seconds, then gently eased the unconscious man to the deck. He was alive, but he was incapacitated. Carter found a length of nylon rope in a deck locker and hogtied Sawyer's hands and feet, his movements quick, his knots professional. The thumping inside the cabin was frantic now. They had heard the wrench fall. Carter turned to the companionway hatch. It was closed and padlocked, a heavy brass lock secured from the outside. He looked around. Sawyer's toolbox was open. He seized a short, heavy crowbar. He jammed it between the hasp and the wood, put his full weight on it, and wrenched. The wood splintered with a sharp cracking sound, and the lock tore free. He ripped the door open. The stench that rolled out was a physical blow, a sickening amalgam of diesel, salt water, mildew, and human waste. "Maverick, with me," Carter commanded. The dog was on the deck in a flash, bounding down the dark steps ahead of him. Carter followed, his pistol drawn, his tactical flashlight cutting a bright white beam into the darkness. "Hello?" A woman's voice screamed, muffled. "Please help us." The main cabin was a shambles, tables and chairs overturned from the storm. Maverick was already at a door in the forward bulkhead, scratching at it frantically, whining. Carter didn't hesitate. He kicked the door. It was flimsy wood and splintered open. He shone the light inside, and his blood ran cold. They were huddled in the darkness of the small triangular V berth, cowering from the light. A man and a woman. Their mouths were sealed with duct tape. Their hands and feet were bound with zip ties. The woman was Dolores. Her eyes, wide and terrified, above the tape, were the same eyes he had envisioned when he read her journal. The man beside her was Evan, the real Evan. He was pale, his face slick with sweat, his body shivering violently. He had a high fever. His leg was stretched out, a crude, bloody bandage wrapped around his calf. "I'm here to help," Carter said, his voice softer than he intended. He holstered his pistol and pulled out his knife. Maverick was already there, pushing his head into Dolores's bound hands, whining, licking the tears from her face. Carter cut the tape from Dolores's mouth first. She gasped, a ragged, desperate lungful of air, then burst into sobs. "Evan, my husband. Save Evan." Carter sliced through her bonds, then moved to Evan. He cut the tape. The man's skin was burning hot. He was barely conscious. "It's okay." Dolores was sobbing, clinging to Carter's arm. "It's okay, who are you? Did you—" "My name is Carter Hayes. I saw your SOS. I read your journal." He cut Evan's last bond. "We need to get you out of here. The other man, the one who was at your camp, his name is Vincent." The truth tumbled out of Dolores, her words fast and frantic, tripping over each other in a rush of terror and relief. "Yes, Vincent. Their boat crashed in the storm just like ours. They found us at the camp." "What did they want?" Carter asked, his mind piecing it together. They had cargo," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Bags, dark, heavy bags. They wanted our supplies. They wanted, I don't know." Evan himself whispered, his voice a dry, feverish rasp. "Evan fought. He tried to protect me." "He's an engineer," Dolores said, grabbing her husband's hand. "He's strong. He fought back while Vincent was hurting me." Evan grabbed a tool from his bag, a sharp metal file, and he stabbed him. He stabbed Vincent in the leg right in the calf. Carter froze. The wound, the laceration. "They were going to kill us," Dolores cried, her voice rising. "Sawyer, the big one, he had a rope. They were tying us up, and then we heard it." "Heard what?" Carter asked, his voice tight. "Your plane?" Evan whispered, his eyes fluttering. "We heard your engine far away, but we heard it. And Vincent, he stopped. He looked up at the sky." Dolores nodded, her face a mask of horrified memory. "He looked at his leg at the blood. Then he looked at Sawyer. He told Sawyer to hide them and keep them quiet. He said, I have an idea. That signal, it's not a trap, it's an opportunity." And then he just ran. He ran toward the beach, toward your sound. We've been here ever since. We thought we were going to die here. The entire sickening, brilliant deception snapped into place. The victim, the performance, the stab wound he'd gotten from the smugglers. It was all a lie. A profoundly horrifying yet masterfully executed improvisation, deeply rooted in genuine agonizing pain. Vincent, the perpetrator of this act, was now back at the camp, armed, waiting, and undoubtedly wondering about Carter's whereabouts. The air within the V-berth was dense and oppressive, yet Carter's voice cut through the burgeoning panic. "We need to depart immediately." Dolores was in a state of shock, her hands trembling, her sobs catching in her throat. But Evan, the true Evan, despite his weakness and burning fever, registered the urgency in Carter's command. He was a survivor. He nodded, his gaze firm. "Assist me in getting up," Evan rasped. Carter wasted no time. He draped Evan's arm over his shoulder, bearing his full weight. "Maverick, lead the way, he ordered. The dog was already ascending the steps, a dark, fleeting shadow in the dimly lit companionway. They emerged onto the deck. The wind continued its relentless shriek. Sawyer, still unconscious and bound, lay precisely where Carter had left him. Dolores gasped and recoiled, but Carter simply guided Evan towards the cliff. "We climb," he stated. The subsequent 30 minutes proved to be a grueling ordeal of vertical ascent. The 50-foot chimney, which had been treacherous for Carter alone, was almost insurmountable with a wounded, feverish man. Carter became an automaton. He propelled Evan onto a ledge, then ascended past him, reaching down to hoist him up by his harness. Dolores, propelled by a terror that had eclipsed her shock, scrambled ahead of them, her fingers raw, her breath ragged in the wind. Maverick was the first to reach the summit, immediately assuming a defensive posture, scrutinizing their back trail, his body low, his ears flattened against the wind. When Carter finally managed to pull Evan over the ridge's edge, they all collapsed, gasping for breath on the wind-swept granite. We cannot," Dolores panted. "We can," Carter affirmed. He rose, his own legs quivering from exhaustion. He glanced back towards the camp. He He knows we're not with him. He's coming. This provided all the motivation they required. The journey back across the island's central ridge was a desperate, stumbling race against the clock. Evan was a dead weight, but he made an effort. His feet dragged, his body supported between Carter and Dolores. Maverick ranged ahead, then behind, forming a frantic, silent perimeter, his nose sampling the wind, his eyes scanning the dense woods. Then they saw it. Through a clearing in the trees, the serene gray expanse of the South Cove, and floating upon it, a beautiful, almost unbelievable sight. The red and white Cessna. They stumbled down the final path, the one Carter had initially taken. They emerged from the trees onto the small, quiet beach. "Get him inside," Carter instructed. It was an awkward, cumbersome process. They waded through the shallow, icy water. Carter and Dolores carefully maneuvered Evan onto the float, then into the cabin, laying him flat across the two rear seats. Dolores clambered in after him, her hands immediately going to her husband's face, whispering his name. Carter slid into the pilot's seat. Maverick leaped in beside him, shaking the cold water from his fur. Carter's hand went to the ignition key, but first he grasped the radio handset. He wasn't sure why. The dead zone, the cliffs. It had been useless, but he felt compelled to try. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he uttered, his voice low and urgent, not expecting a response. "This is Cessna November 5185 Kilo at Musal Island, South Cove." A burst of static and then, 85 Kilo, this is United States Coast Guard Bar Harbor Station. I read you. What is your situation? The voice was a marvel. It was calm, professional, and authoritative. Carter felt a wave of relief so profound his knees almost buckled. It had functioned. The atmospheric conditions, the time of day, a simple stroke of luck. It was irrelevant. "Bar Harbor, this is 85 Kilo. Carter stated, his voice steady. "I have 2 rescued civilians, one in critical condition with a fever and a leg wound. I have 2 hostiles on the island. One is secured on the north side. The second is at large, armed and dangerous." "Understood. 85 Kilo," the voice replied. "This is Commander Spencer. We have a Jayhawk helicopter spinning up right now. Can you provide a situation report on the second hostile?" "Negative, Bar Harbor. He is the man who faked the wait." Carter's words abruptly ceased. Maverick. The dog was not looking at Carter. He was not looking at the radio. He was staring intently at the beach, at the dark opening of the trail. A low, vicious, terrifying sound vibrated from the dog's chest. A growl so deep it was almost felt rather than heard. "No," Dolores whispered from the back, her voice a thin thread of renewed terror. A figure emerged from the woods. It was Vincent. He was a nightmare. The mask of the victim had vanished, replaced by a contorted face of pure animalistic fury. He was limping, dragging his bandaged leg, but he moved with terrifying, focused speed. In his right hand, he held a dark, snub-nosed pistol. "You!" he shrieked, his voice raw and broken. He was on the beach, 20 yards distant, wading into the shallows. You abandoned me." He raised the pistol. He was aiming at Carter, a clear shot through the windscreen. Carter's own pistol was holstered, trapped by his seatbelt. He was a defenseless target. "Carter!" Dolores screamed. Vincent's hand steadied. He was taking aim. "Maverick!" Carter's voice was low, a single sharp command. "Get him!" The dog required no further instruction. He was a gray and white blur. He launched from the co-pilot seat over Carter's lap, out the open door, and onto the float. In a single explosive movement, he hit the water. Vincent saw the attacking animal. His aim wavered, shifting from Carter to the dog. A sharp, flat crack echoed off the cliffs as the gun discharged. The bullet went wide, striking the water in a harmless white splash. Maverick didn't even flinch. He crossed the shallow water in 3 massive bounds. Vincent attempted to aim again, but it was too late. Maverick did not target the gun arm. He did not target the throat. He knew precisely what to do. He slammed his 90-pound body at full speed directly into Vincent's injured left leg. The sound was not a gunshot. It was a heavy, wet, sickening thud, followed by a high, thin scream that was not human. Vincent's leg, already torn and battered, could not withstand the impact. It buckled instantly. Vincent collapsed into the shallows, his body folding like a puppet, the gun flying from his nerveless fingers and sinking into the gray water. He landed in a heap, clutching his leg, his screams now mere agonized, animalistic sobs. Maverick stood over him, chest heaving, teeth bared, a low growl rumbling from him. He did not bite. He did not need to. The threat was neutralized. Carter was out of the plane, his own gun in hand, wading through the water. He kicked Vincent's pistol deeper into the mud. He looked at the man, now reduced to a pathetic, broken thing, whimpering in the surf. Then he heard it, a deep thrumming sound that was not his own engine. A sound that grew louder, reverberating against the cliffs. A U.S. Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter, painted bright orange and white, appeared over the southern ridge. It was swift. It settled onto the small beach in a deafening whirlwind of sand and prop wash. The side door slid open. Medics and armed Coast Guard personnel disembarked. A man in a crisp uniform, in his 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes, jumped down and strode towards Carter. "Commander Spencer," he stated, offering no hand, merely assessing. "Carter Hayes," Carter replied, holstering his weapon. "He's the second hostile. His partner Sawyer is on the north side in a beached motor yacht. He's incapacitated." "We'll retrieve him," Spencer said. His eyes flickered from Carter to the dog, who was now calmly sitting at Carter's side. "You performed admirably, Mr. Hayes." Medics were already at the plane, carefully easing Evan onto a stretcher. Dolores climbed out, her face a mask of tears and relief. She ran to Carter and threw her arms around him, her body shaking. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you." Carter froze. It was a physical contact he was unaccustomed to. He awkwardly patted her on the back. "They'll care for you," he said. He and Maverick stepped back as the summary had concluded. They watched the medics work with efficient, calm precision. They watched them load Evan into the helicopter. Dolores climbed in, never releasing her husband's hand. She looked back at Carter, her eyes conveying more than any words ever could. The helicopter lifted off, its rotor wash tearing at Carter's jacket. The adversaries were secured by the remaining Coast Guard crew. And then there was silence. The island was quiet once more, save for the wind. Carter stood on the beach, the cold wind chilling his damp clothes. He was alone again, just him and his dog. He had anticipated the familiar hollow feeling to return, the emptiness of a completed mission, the cold ache of his self-imposed solitude. But it did not come. He watched the helicopter become a tiny black speck against the clearing sky. He thought of Dolores and Evan, safe. He thought of the journal. He thought of Adrian. This time, he had been present. This time, he had not been helpless. He was still alone here on this desolate beach. But for the first time in years, the solitude didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like a punishment. It simply was. Maverick nudged his cold, wet nose into Carter's hand. Carter looked down at him. "Let's go home, Mav." He untied his plane. He climbed in. Maverick took his seat, his fur already drying. Carter started the engine. The familiar, deafening roar filled the cabin, a protective barrier. He took off, ascending out of the cove, the gray-green island shrinking behind him. He banked the Cessna, pointing its nose towards the mainland, towards home. He reached over and rested his hand on Maverick's head. The dog leaned into the touch, a low, contented sound in his chest. The engine was still loud. It was still a wall of sound. But the silence inside Carter, the one he had always been fleeing, the one that had always been filled with the echoes of his past, was different. It was no longer a flight. It was tranquility restored. The narrative of Carter and Maverick serves as a profound reminder that genuine devotion, the kind that never scrutinizes, can serve as a steadfast anchor amidst the most turbulent waters. It illustrates that even when we feel adrift in the reverberations of what has been, a courageous and loyal spirit can lead us back to the current moment, assisting us in rediscovering the serenity we believed was irrevocably lost. Should that connection resonate with you, we extend an invitation to join our community. Your endorsement through subscribing, liking, and disseminating this account enables us to perpetuate these stories. We would be profoundly privileged to peruse your personal insights in the comment section below. Furthermore, the expedition need not conclude at this juncture.